191. The Sea Hare. There was once a princess who had in her castle high above the battlements a hall with 12 windows which looked out in all directions of the compass, and when she climbed up and looked around, she could oversee her entire kingdom. From the first window, her vision was sharper than any other person's. From the second, even better. From the third, clearer still, and so on until the 12th, where she could see everything above and below the earth, and nothing could be hidden from her. Because she was proud and did not wish to submit to anyone, preferring to maintain sole dominion, she proclaimed that no one would become her husband unless he could hide from her so effectively that she could not find him. Whoever attempted this and was discovered would have his head struck off and placed on a stake. 97 stakes with dead men's heads already stood before the castle, and for a long time, no one had come forward. The princess was pleased and thought, "Now I shall remain free for the rest of my life." Then 3 brothers appeared before her and announced that they wished to try their luck. The eldest believed he would be safe if he crept into a lime pit, but she saw him from the first window, had him pulled out, and his head cut off. The second crept into the cellar of the palace, but she also saw him from the first window, and his fate was sealed. His head was placed on the 99th stake. Then the youngest stepped forward and begged her to give him a day to consider, and also to be gracious enough to overlook it if she should discover him twice. But if he failed the third time, he would consider his life over. Because he was so handsome and pleaded so earnestly, she said, "Yes, I will grant you that, but you will not succeed." The following day, he pondered for a long time how he should hide, but it was in vain. Then he took his gun and went out hunting. He saw a raven and took aim at it. Just as he was about to shoot, the raven cried, "Do not shoot! I will repay you." He lowered his gun, moved on, and came to a lake where he surprised a large fish that had come up from the depths to the surface of the water. When he aimed at it, the fish cried, "Do not shoot! I will repay you." He let it dive down again, moved on, and encountered a fox that was limping. He shot and missed it. The fox cried, "Come here and pull the thorn from my foot." He did so, but then wanted to kill the fox and skin it. The fox said, "Stop, and I will repay you." The youth let him go, and as it was evening, he returned home. On the next day, he was supposed to hide himself, but no matter how much he racked his brains, he didn't know where to go. He went into the forest to the raven and said, "I spared your life. Now tell me where I should hide so that the princess cannot see me." The raven hung his head and thought for a long time. Finally, he croaked, "I've got it." He fetched an egg from his nest, split it into 2 parts, and locked the youth inside. Then he sealed it up again and sat on top. When the princess approached the first window, she couldn't spot him, nor in the following ones, and she began to grow anxious. But in the 11th, she saw him. She ordered the raven to be shot, the egg brought and broken open, and the youth had to come out. She said, "You are excused this once. If you don't do better next time, you're done for." The following day he went to the lake, called the fish, and said, "I spared your life. Now tell me where I should hide so that the princess cannot see me." The fish thought for a while and finally cried, "I've got it. I will lock you inside my belly." He swallowed him and went down to the bottom of the lake. The princess looked through her windows, didn't see him in the 11th either, and was alarmed, but finally spotted him in the 12th. She ordered the fish to be caught and killed, and the youth appeared. One can imagine how he felt. She said, "You have been forgiven twice, but your head will surely end up on the 100th stake." On the last day, he went into the countryside with a heavy heart and met the fox. "You know how to find all kinds of hiding places," he said. "I spared your life. Now advise me where I should hide so that the princess cannot find me." "That's a tough one," answered the fox, looking very thoughtful. Finally, he cried, "I've got it." He went with him to a spring, dipped himself in it, and emerged as a market trader and animal dealer. The youth had to dip himself in the water as well and was transformed into a small sea hare. The merchant went into town and showed the cute little animal. A crowd gathered to see it, including the princess who liked it so much, she bought it and paid the merchant handsomely for it. Before handing it over to her, he said to it, "When the princess goes to the window, quickly crawl under her braids." Now came the time for her to search for him. She went to each window in turn, from the first to the 11th, and did not see him. When she didn't see him at the 12th either, she was full of anxiety and anger, and slammed it shut so violently that the glass in every window shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the entire castle shook. She returned and felt the sea hair under her braids. She seized it, threw it to the ground, exclaiming, "Away with you! Get out of my sight!" It ran to the merchant, and both hurried to the spring, where they plunged in and regained their true forms. The youth thanked the fox and said, "The raven and the fish are fools compared to you. You know the right tricks. That must be true." The youth went straight to the palace. The princess was already expecting him and resigned herself to her fate. The wedding was celebrated, and now he was the king and lord of the entire kingdom. He never told her where he had hidden himself for the third time or who had helped him, so she believed he had done everything through his own skill, and she respected him greatly, thinking to herself, "He can do more than I." 192. The Master Thief. One day, an old man and his wife sat resting in front of a humble house, taking a break from their work. Suddenly, a magnificent carriage drawn by 4 bay horses approached, and a richly dressed gentleman stepped out. The farmer stood up, approached the gentleman, and asked what his desire was and how he could serve him. The stranger extended his hand to the old man and said, "I wish for nothing more than to enjoy a rustic dish once. Prepare me potatoes as you usually eat them, and then I will sit at your table and gladly consume them." The farmer smiled and said, "You must be a count or prince, or even a duke. Noble lords sometimes have such cravings. Your wish shall be granted, however." The wife went into the kitchen and began to wash and grate potatoes, intending to make dumplings as the peasants do. While she worked, the farmer said to the stranger, "Come with me to my house garden for now, where I have some work to do." In the garden, he had dug holes and now intended to plant trees. "Do you have any children?" asked the stranger, "who could help you with your work?" "No," replied the farmer. "I did have a son once," he added, "but he has been gone to the wide world for a long time. He was a disobedient boy, clever and sly, but he didn't want to learn and caused nothing but mischief. Finally, he ran away from me, and since then, I haven't heard anything from him." The old man took a sapling, placed it in a hole, and set a stake beside it. After shoveling soil into the hole and packing it down firmly, he tied the trunk securely to the stake with straw rope at the bottom, top, and middle. "Tell me," said the gentleman, "why do you not tie the crooked, gnarled tree over there in the corner, almost bent to the ground, to a stake like this one so that it grows straight?" The old man smiled and said, "Sir, you speak as you understand. It's clear you haven't dealt with gardening. That tree there is old and gnarled. No one can straighten it now. Trees must be trained while they are young." "It's like with your son," said the stranger. "If you had disciplined him when he was young, he wouldn't have run away. Now he must have become tough and stubborn." "Indeed," replied the old man. "It's been a long time since he left. He must have changed." "Would you recognize him if he stood before you?" asked the stranger. "Hardly by his face," replied the farmer, "but he has a distinctive mark, a birthmark on his shoulder that looks like a bean." Having said this, the stranger took off his coat, bared his shoulder, and showed the farmer the birthmark. "Good Lord," exclaimed the old man, "you are truly my son," and love for his child stirred in his heart. "But," he added, "how can you be my son? You have become a great lord and live in wealth and abundance. How did you come to this?" "And, father," replied the son, "the young tree was not tied to a stake and grew crooked. Now it's too old. It won't straighten again. How did I acquire all this? I became a thief. But don't be alarmed. I am a master thief. For me, there are no locks or bolts. What I desire is mine. Don't think that I steal like a common thief. I only take from the excess of the rich. Poor people are safe. I prefer to give to them rather than take from them. So, anything I can obtain without difficulty, cunning, or skill, I do not touch." "Oh, my son," said the father, "it doesn't please me at all. A thief remains a thief. Mark my words, it will not end well." He led him to his mother, and when she heard that it was her son, she wept for joy. But when he told her that he had become a master thief, 2 streams of tears flowed down her face. Finally, she said, "Even if he has become a thief, He is still my son, and my eyes have seen him once more." They sat down at the table, and he ate again with his parents the humble fare that he hadn't eaten in a long time. The father spoke. "If our lord, the count over in the castle, finds out who you are and what you're up to, he won't cradle you in his arms as he did when he held you at the baptismal font. Instead, he'll let you swing on the gallows rope. Do not worry, father. He won't harm me, for I understand my trade. I will go to him myself today." As evening approached, the master thief got into his carriage and drove to the castle. The count received him courteously, thinking him a nobleman. But when the stranger revealed himself, the count turned pale and fell silent for a while. Finally he spoke. "You are my godson. Therefore I will show mercy and be lenient with you. Since you boast of being a master thief, I will test your skill. If you fail, you must marry the ropemaker's daughter, and the cawing of crows shall be your music." "My lord count," replied the master, "set 3 tasks for me, as difficult as you wish, and if I do not solve your challenge, do with me as you please." The count pondered for a moment, then said, "Very well. First, steal my saddle horse from the stable. Second, remove the bedsheet from under my wife and me while we are asleep, without us noticing, and also take my wife's wedding ring from her finger. Third and lastly, steal the priest and the sexton from the church. Remember everything well, for your life depends on it." The master went to the nearest town. There he bought clothes from an old peasant woman and put them on. Then he dyed his face brown and painted wrinkles on it so that no one would recognize him. Finally, he filled a small cask with old Hungarian wine mixed with a strong sleeping draught. He placed the cask on a cart, which he carried on his back, and walked with deliberate, swaying steps towards the count's castle. It was already dark when he arrived. He sat down in the courtyard on a stone, started coughing like an old woman with a chest ailment, and rubbed his hands as if he were cold. Outside the stable door, soldiers were gathered around a fire. One of them noticed the woman and called out, "Come closer, old mother, and warm yourself by our fire. You have no place to spend the night, so take what you can find." The old woman shuffled over, asked them to lift the cart from her back, and sat down with them by the fire. "What do you have in that cask, you old bag?" asked one of the soldiers. "A good sip of wine," she replied. "I make a living with my trade. I'll gladly give you a glass for money or kind words." "Hand it over," said the soldier, and after tasting a glass, he exclaimed, "If the wine is good, I'd rather have another glass," and had it refilled. The others followed suit. "Hey, comrades," one called to those inside the stable, "here's an old lady with wine as old as she is. Have a sip. It warms your stomach even better than our fire." The old woman carried her cask into the stable. One soldier sat on the saddled saddle horse, another held the reins, and a third grabbed the tail. She poured as much as was asked until the source ran dry. Before long, one soldier dropped the reins, fell asleep, and started snoring. The other let go of the tail, lay down, and snored even louder. The one sitting in the saddle remained seated, but bent his head almost to the horse's neck, sleeping and puffing like a bellows. The soldiers outside had long since fallen asleep on the ground, motionless as if turned to stone. Seeing that he had succeeded, the master thief gave the one holding the reins a rope instead, and the one holding the tail a straw bundle. But what was he to do with the one sitting on the horse's back? He didn't want to throw him off, as he might wake up and raise an alarm. However, he knew what to do. He loosened the saddle girth, tied a few ropes hanging from rings on the wall to the saddle, lifted the sleeping rider with the saddle into the air, then wrapped the ropes around a post and secured them. He quickly untied the horse from its chain. But if he had ridden over the castle's stone courtyard, the noise would have been heard inside. So he wrapped the horse's hooves with old rags beforehand, let it out cautiously, mounted, and galloped away. When the day dawned, the master rode to the castle on the stolen horse. The count had just risen and was looking out of the window. "Good morning, Count," he called to him. "Here is the horse that I successfully retrieved from the stable. Just look at how comfortably your soldiers lie there asleep, and if you wish to go to the stable, you will see how snugly your guards have made themselves." The count chuckled, then said, "Once you've succeeded, but the second time won't be so fortunate. And I warn you, If you encounter me as a thief, I will treat you as such." When the Countess went to bed in the evening, she clasped her hand tightly around the wedding ring, and the Count said, "All doors are locked and bolted. I will stay awake and wait for the thief. But if he enters through the window, I will shoot him down." Meanwhile, in the darkness, the master thief went out to the gallows, cut down a poor sinner hanging there, and carried him on his back to the castle. There, he leaned a ladder against the bedroom, placed the dead man on his shoulders, and began to climb up. When he had reached a height where the dead man's head appeared at the window, the Count, lurking in his bed, fired a pistol at him. Immediately, the master let the poor sinner fall, leaped down the ladder himself, and hid in a corner. The moonlight illuminated the night enough for the master to see clearly, as the Count climbed down from the ladder, took the dead man to the garden, and began to dig a hole to bury him. "Now," thought the thief, "the opportune moment has come," stealthily emerged from his hiding place, and climbed the ladder straight into the Countess's bedroom. "Dear lady," he began in the Count's voice, "the thief is dead. But he was my godfather, and more of a rogue than a villain. I do not wish to expose him to public shame, and I also pity his poor parents. Before daybreak, I will bury him myself in the garden, so that this matter does not become public. Give me the bedsheet as well, so that I can wrap the body and not bury him like a dog." The Countess gave him the sheet. "You know," continued the thief, "I feel a wave of generosity. Give me the ring as well. The unfortunate man risked his life, so let him take it with him to the grave." Reluctant to defy the Count, though she did so reluctantly, she took the ring off her finger and handed it over. The thief took both items and made off successfully, arriving home before the Count had finished his grave digging in the garden. What a long face the Count made the next morning when the master came and brought him the bedsheet and the ring. "Can you perform magic?" he said to him. "Who has raised you from the grave into which I myself laid you and brought you back to life?" "You did not bury me," said the thief, "but the poor sinner from the gallows," and he explained in detail how it had happened. The Count had to admit that he was a clever and cunning thief. "But you are not done yet," he added. "You still have the third task to solve, and if you fail at that, nothing will help you." The master smiled and gave no answer. When night fell, he came to the village church with a long sack on his back, a bundle under his arm, and a lantern in his hand. In the sack he had crabs, and in the bundle were short wax candles. He sat down in the churchyard, took out a crab, stuck a wax candle on its back, lit the candle, set the crab on the ground, and let it crawl. He took out a second one from the sack, did the same with it, and continued until the last one was out of the sack. Then he put on a long black garment resembling a monk's habit and glued a gray beard to his chin. When he was completely unrecognizable, he took the sack that had held the crabs, went into the church, and climbed onto the pulpit. The clock in the tower struck 12 just as the last chime faded away. He cried out in a loud, piercing voice, "Listen, you sinful people, the end of all things has come. The last day is near. Listen, listen. Whoever wants to enter heaven with me, crawl into the sack. I am Peter, who opens and closes the gates of heaven. Look outside in the churchyard, where the dead are walking and gathering their bones. Come, come and crawl into the sack. The world is ending." The shouting echoed throughout the whole village. The pastor and the sexton, who lived near the church, were the first to hear it. When they saw the lights moving around the churchyard, they realized something unusual was happening and entered the church. They listened to the sermon for a while. Then the sexton nudged the pastor and said, "It wouldn't be a bad idea if we took advantage of this opportunity and found an easy way to heaven before the last day arrives." "Indeed," replied the pastor, "those were also my thoughts. If you're willing, let's make our way." "Yes," answered the sexton, "but you, Reverend, take the lead. I'll follow." So the pastor stepped forward and climbed onto the pulpit where the master opened the sack. The pastor crawled in first, followed by the sexton. Immediately, the master securely tied up the sack, grabbed it by the bundle, and dragged it down the pulpit stairs. Each time the heads of the two fools hit the steps, he exclaimed, "Now we're crossing the mountains." Then he dragged them through the village in the same manner, and when they passed through puddles, he cried, "Now we're passing through the wet clouds." And finally, as he dragged them up the castle stairs, he shouted, "Now we're on the stairway to heaven and will soon be in the courtyard." When he reached the top, he shoved the sack into the dovecote, and as the doves fluttered, he said, "Do you hear how the angels rejoice and flap their wings?" Then he bolted the latch and departed. The next morning, he went to the count and told him that he had also completed the third task by leading the pastor and sexton away from the church. "Where have you left them?" asked the count. "They are lying in a sack on top of the dovecot, imagining they are in heaven." The count climbed up himself and confirmed that he had spoken the truth. After he had freed the pastor and sexton from their plight, he said, "You are a master thief, and you have won your case. For this time, you get away unscathed, but make sure to leave my land, because if you set foot here again, you can count on being raised on the gallows." The master thief bid farewell to his parents, went back into the wide world, and no one has heard anything of him since. 193. The Drummer. One evening, a young drummer went alone into the fields and arrived at a lake where he saw 3 pieces of fine white linen lying on the shore. "What fine linen," he said, and tucked one into his pocket. He went home, thought no more of his find, and went to bed. Just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard someone calling his name. He listened and heard a soft voice calling out, "Drummer, drummer, wake up!" In the dark night, he couldn't see anyone, but it seemed to him as if a figure was hovering beside his bed. "What do you want?" he asked. "Give me back my little shirt," replied the voice, "which you took from me last evening at the lake." "You shall have it back," said the drummer, "if you tell me who you are." "Ah," replied the voice, "I am the daughter of a mighty king, but I have fallen into the clutches of a witch and am banished to the glass mountain. Every day I must bathe with my 2 sisters in the lake, but without my little shirt, I cannot fly away again. My sisters have escaped, but I had to remain behind. I beg you, give me back my little shirt." "Be calm, poor child," said the drummer. "I will gladly return it to you." He took it out of his pocket and handed it to her in the darkness. She seized it hastily and wanted to depart with it. "Wait a moment," he said. "Perhaps I can help you. You can only help me if you climb the glass mountain and free me from the witch's power. But you cannot reach the glass mountain, and even if you were very close to it, you could not ascend." "What I want, I can do," said the drummer. "I pity you and fear nothing, but I do not know the way that leads to the glass mountain." "The path goes through the great forest where the man-eaters dwell," she replied. "That's all I can tell you." With that, he heard her flutter away. At daybreak, the drummer set out, slung his drum over his shoulder, and marched fearlessly straight into the forest. After walking a while without seeing any giants, he thought to himself, "I must wake the sleepyheads." He hung his drum in front of him and beat a roll that startled the birds from the trees with a flurry of cries. Before long, a giant rose up who had been lying and sleeping in the grass, towering as tall as a fir tree. "You puny fellow," he called out, "why are you drumming here and disturbing my best sleep?" "I drum," he replied, "because many thousands are following behind me, needing to know the way." "What do they want here in my forest?" asked the giant. "They want to do away with you and rid the forest of a monster like yourself," answered the drummer. "Oh ho," said the giant, "I could crush them like ants." "Do you think you could do anything against them?" said the drummer. "When you bend down to grab one, he jumps away and hides. But when you lie down to sleep, they come out from all the bushes and crawl all over you. Each one has a steel hammer at their belt to bash your skull in." The giant grew annoyed and thought, "If I deal with these cunning folk, it could turn against me. I squeeze the throats of wolves and bears, but I can't protect myself from earthworms." "Listen, little fellow," he said, "go away again. I promise that I will leave you and your comrades in peace from now on. If you have any other wish, tell me, and I will gladly do something to please you." "You have long legs," said the drummer, "and can run faster than I. Carry me to the glass mountain, and I will give my people a signal to retreat, and this time they shall leave you in peace." "Come here, worm," said the giant. "Sit on my shoulder. I will carry you wherever you wish." The giant lifted him up, and the drummer began to beat his drum heartily. The giant thought, "This will be the signal for the others to go back." After a while, Another giant stood in their path, took the drummer from the first giant, and placed him in his buttonhole. The drummer grasped the button, which was as large as a bowl, held onto it, and looked around cheerfully. Then they came to a third giant, who took him from the buttonhole and placed him on the brim of his hat. There the drummer went up and down and looked over the trees, and when he saw a mountain in the blue distance, he thought, "That must surely be the glass mountain." And indeed it was. The giant took only a few more steps, and they arrived at the foot of the mountain, where the giant set him down. The drummer asked to be carried to the top of the glass mountain, but the giant shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and went back into the forest. Now the poor drummer stood before the mountain, which was as high as if 3 mountains were piled on top of each other, and as smooth as a mirror, and he didn't know how to get up. He started to climb, but in vain. He kept slipping back down. If only I were a bird now, he thought, but wishing was of no use. Wings did not sprout for him. While he stood there, not knowing what to do, he spotted 2 men not far from him who were arguing vehemently. He approached them and saw that they were quarreling over a saddle lying on the ground before them, each wanting it for himself. "What fools you are," he said, "arguing over a saddle and not even having a horse to go with it." "The saddle is worth fighting for," replied one of the men. "Whoever sits on it and wishes to go anywhere, even to the ends of the earth, will arrive there in an instant upon making the wish. The saddle belongs to both of us jointly, and it's my turn to ride on it, but the other won't allow it." "I will settle this dispute quickly," said the drummer, went a short distance, and stuck a white rod into the ground. Then he returned and said, "Now run towards the goal. Whoever gets there first shall ride first." They both trotted off, but as soon as they were a few steps away, the drummer swung himself onto the saddle, wished himself to the glass mountain, and before you could turn your hand, he was there. On top of the mountain was a plain where an old stone house stood, and in front of the house was a large fish pond, with a dark forest behind it. He saw neither people nor animals. Everything was quiet. Only the wind rustled in the trees, and the clouds passed closely overhead. He approached the door and knocked. After knocking for the 3rd time, an old woman with a brown face and red eyes opened the door. She had glasses on her long nose and looked at him sharply, then asked what his desire was. "Admission, food, and a place to sleep," answered the drummer. "You shall have that," said the old woman, "if you are willing to perform 3 tasks in return." "Why not?" he replied. "I fear no task, no matter how difficult." The old woman let him in, gave him food and a good bed in the evening. In the morning, after he had rested, the old woman took a thimble from her skinny finger, handed it to the drummer, and said, "Now go to work and empty the pond outside with this thimble. But you must be finished before nightfall, and all the fish in the water must be sorted by their kind and size." "That is a strange task," said the drummer, but he went to the pond and began to scoop. He scooped all morning, but what can one accomplish with a thimble in a large body of water, even if one were to scoop for 1,000 years? By noon, he thought, "It's all in vain, whether I work or not," stopped, and sat down. Then a girl came out of the house, set down a basket of food, and said, "You sit there so sadly. What troubles you?" He looked at her and saw that she was extraordinarily beautiful. "Ach," he said, "I cannot complete the first task. How will it be with the others? I set out to seek a king's daughter who is said to reside here, but I have not found her. I will continue on my way." "Stay here," said the girl. "I will help you out of your trouble. You are tired. Lay your head in my lap and sleep. When you awaken, the work will be done." The drummer didn't need to be told twice. As soon as his eyes closed, she turned a wish ring and said, "Water rise, fish come forth." Immediately, the water rose like white mist and drifted away with the other clouds, and the fish snapped, jumped onto the shore, and lined up side by side, each according to its size and kind. When the drummer awoke, he saw with amazement that everything was accomplished. But the girl said, "One of the fish does not lie with its kind, but all alone. When the old woman comes this evening and sees that everything she asked for has been done, she will ask, 'What is this fish doing alone?' Then throw the fin her face and say, 'That is for you, old witch.' In the evening, the old woman came, and when she asked the question, he threw the fish in her face. She pretended not to notice and remained silent, but she looked at him with malicious eyes. The next morning she said, "Yesterday you had it too easy. I must give you harder work. Today you must cut down the entire forest, split the wood into logs and stack it in cords, and everything must be finished by evening." She gave him an axe, a maul, and 2 wedges. But the axe was made of lead. The maul and wedges were made of tin. When he started chopping, the axe turned over and the maul and wedges squeezed together. He didn't know what to do, but at noon the girl came back with food and comforted him. "Lay your head in my lap," she said, "and sleep. When you wake up, the work will be done." She turned her wish ring. In that moment, the entire forest crashed down with a roar. The wood split by itself and stacked itself into cords. It was as if invisible giants were doing the work. When he woke up, the girl said, "You see, the wood is corded and stacked. Only a single branch is left. But when the old woman comes this evening and asks what the branch is for, give her a blow with it and say, 'That is for you, you witch.'" The old woman came. "You see," she said, "how easy the work was, but for whom is the branch still there?" "For you, you witch," he answered, and gave her a blow with it. But she pretended not to feel it, laughed scornfully, and said, "Tomorrow morning you shall pile all the wood into a heap, set it on fire, and burn it." He rose at daybreak and began to gather the wood. But how can one person gather an entire forest together? The work did not progress. Yet the girl did not abandon him in his distress. She brought him his midday meal, and after he had eaten, he laid his head in her lap and fell asleep. When he awoke, the entire woodpile was burning in a tremendous flame, its tongues stretching up to the sky. "Listen to me," said the girl. "When the witch comes, she will give you all sorts of tasks. If you fearlessly do what she asks, she cannot harm you. But if you fear, the fire will seize you and consume you. Finally, when you have done everything, seize her with both hands and throw her into the middle of the fire." The girl went away, and the old woman crept up. "Ho! I am cold," she said. "But this is a fire that burns. It warms my old bones. I feel well. But there is a log there that won't burn. Fetch it out for me. If you do that, you are free and can go wherever you want. Just boldly go in." The drummer did not hesitate long. He jumped into the flames, but they did nothing to him, not even singe his hair. He pulled out the log and laid it down. But as soon as the wood touched the ground, it transformed, and the beautiful girl stood before him, the one who had helped him in his need. And by the silken, golden clothes she wore, he knew well that she was the king's daughter. But the old woman laughed maliciously and said, "You think you have her, but you do not yet." Just as she was about to attack the girl and take her away, he seized the old woman with both hands, lifted her up, and threw her into the flames, which closed over her, as if rejoicing to consume a witch. The princess looked at the drummer, and seeing that he was a handsome youth who had risked his life to rescue her, she reached out her hand and said, "You have risked everything for me, but I will also do everything for you. If you promise me your loyalty, you shall become my husband. We lack no riches. We have enough from what the witch has gathered here." She led him into the house where chests and boxes filled with treasures stood. They left behind gold and silver, taking only the precious stones. She did not want to stay any longer on the glass mountain, so he said to her, "Sit with me on my saddle, and we will fly down like birds." "I do not like the old saddle," she said. "I only need to turn my wish ring, and we will be home." "Very well," replied the drummer. "Then wish us to the city gate." In an instant they were there, but the drummer said, "First I want to go to my parents and give them news. Wait for me here in the field. I will return soon." "Oh," said the princess, "I beg you, be careful not to kiss your parents on the right cheek when you arrive, or you will forget everything, and I will remain here alone and abandoned in the field." "How could I forget you?" he said, promising her to return soon. When he entered his father's house, no one knew who he was, for he had changed so much. The 3 days he had spent on the glass mountain had been 3 long years. He revealed himself, and his parents embraced him with joy, and he was so moved in his heart that he kissed them on both cheeks, forgetting the girl's words. But after kissing them on the right cheek, all thoughts of the princess disappeared from his mind. He emptied his pockets and laid handfuls of the finest jewels on the table. His parents did not know what to do with such wealth. So the father built a magnificent castle surrounded by gardens, forests, and meadows, as if a prince were to live there. And when it was finished, the mother said, "I have chosen a girl for you. The wedding will be in 3 days." The son agreed to everything his parents desired. The poor princess had stood for a long time outside the town, waiting for the return of the young man. As evening fell, she said, "Certainly, he kissed his parents on the right cheek and forgot about me." Her heart was full of sorrow. She wished to be in a lonely forest cottage and did not want to return to her father's court. Every evening, she went into the town and passed by his house. He saw her sometimes, but he no longer recognized her. Finally, she heard people saying, "Tomorrow his wedding will be celebrated." Then she said, "I will try to win back his heart." When the first wedding day was celebrated, she turned her wish ring and said, "A dress as radiant as the sun." Immediately, the dress lay before her, gleaming as if woven from pure sunbeams. When all the guests had assembled, she entered the hall. Everyone marveled at the beautiful dress, especially the bride, and since beautiful clothes were her greatest pleasure, she approached the stranger and asked if she would sell it to her. "Not for money," she replied, "but if I may spend the first night outside the door where the bridegroom sleeps, then I will give it to you." The bride could not resist her desire and agreed, but she mixed a sleeping potion into the groom's night wine, causing him to fall into a deep sleep. When everything was quiet, the princess crouched outside the door of the bedchamber, opened it a little, and called inside, "Drummer, drummer, hear me. Have you completely forgotten me? Did you not sit with me on the glass mountain? Did I not save your life from the witch? Did you not pledge your hand to me in loyalty? Drummer, drummer, hear me." But it was all in vain. The drummer did not wake up, and when morning broke, the princess had to leave empty-handed once again. On the second evening, she turned her wish ring and said, "A dress as silver as the moon." When she appeared at the feast with the dress, so delicate as the moonlight, she again aroused the bride's desire and gave it to her in exchange for permission to spend the second night outside the door of the bedchamber. In the quiet of the night, she called out, "Drummer, drummer, hear me. Have you completely forgotten me? Did you not sit with me on the glass mountain? Did I not save your life from the witch? Did you not pledge your hand to me in loyalty? Drummer, drummer, hear me." But the drummer, stupefied by the sleeping draught, could not be awakened. Sadly, she returned to her forest cottage the next morning. However, the people in the house had heard the lament of the strange girl and told the groom about it. They also told him that it had been impossible for him to hear anything because they had poured a sleeping draught into his wine. On the third evening, the princess turned her wish ring and said, "A dress shimmering like stars." When she appeared at the feast in it, the bride was beside herself with the splendor of the dress, which far surpassed the others, and said, "I should and must have it." Like the others, the girl gave it to her in exchange for permission to spend the night outside the groom's door. However, the groom did not drink the wine that was given to him before going to bed. Instead, he poured it behind the bed. And when everything in the house had become quiet, he heard a soft voice calling to him, "Drummer, drummer, hear me. Have you completely forgotten me? Did you not sit with me on the glass mountain? Did I not save your life from the witch? Did you not pledge your hand to me in loyalty? Drummer, drummer, hear me." Suddenly his memory returned. "Ah," he cried, "how could I have acted so faithlessly? But the kiss that I gave my parents on the right cheek in the joy of my heart, that is to blame. It has stupefied me." He jumped up, took the princess by the hand, and led her to his parents' bed. "This is my true bride," he said. "If I marry the other, I do great wrong." When the parents heard how everything had unfolded, they consented. Then the lights in the hall were lit again, drums and trumpets were brought forth, friends and relatives were invited to return, and the true wedding was celebrated with great joy. The first bride kept the beautiful clothes as compensation and was satisfied. The ear of corn. In former times, when God himself still walked the earth, the fruitfulness of the soil was much greater than it is now. At that time, the ears of corn did not bear 50 or 60-fold, but 400 to 500-fold. The grains grew on the stalk from bottom to top. As long as the stalk was, so long was the ear. People, however, tend to become indifferent and careless when they have an abundance and no longer appreciate the blessings that come from God. One day, a woman was passing by a cornfield, and her little child, who was running beside her, fell into a puddle and dirtied its frock. The mother tore off a handful of the beautiful ears of corn and cleaned the frock with them. When the Lord, who happened to be passing by, saw this, he was angry and said, "Henceforth, the corn stalk shall bear no more ears. People are no longer worthy of heavenly gifts." The bystanders who heard this were terrified and fell to their knees, begging him to leave something on the stalks, even if they themselves did not deserve it, for the sake of the innocent chickens which would otherwise starve. The Lord, foreseeing their suffering, took pity and granted their request. Thus, the ear of corn remained as it now grows. The grave mound. One day, a rich farmer was standing in his yard, looking over his fields and gardens. The corn was growing vigorously, and the fruit trees were laden with fruit. The grain from the previous year still lay in such large heaps on the ground that the beams could hardly support the weight. He then went to the stable, where the fattened oxen, the fat cows, and the sleek horses stood. Finally, he returned to his room and glanced at the iron chests where his money lay. As he stood there surveying his wealth, there was suddenly a loud knock. It was not at the door of his room, but at the door of his heart. It opened, and he heard a voice speaking to him. "Have you done well by your family with your wealth? Have you considered the needs of the poor? Have you shared your bread with the hungry? Were you content with what you had, or did you always want more?" His heart did not hesitate to answer, "I have been hard and unyielding, and have never done any good for my family. If a poor person came, I turned away my eyes. I have not cared about God, only about increasing my wealth. If everything the sky covers had been mine, I still would not have had enough." When he heard this answer, he was greatly alarmed. His knees began to tremble, and he had to sit down. Then there was another knock, this time at the door of his room. It was his neighbor, a poor man with a number of children he could no longer feed. "I know," thought the poor man, "my neighbor is rich, but he is just as hard. I do not believe he will help me, but my children are crying for bread, so I will take a chance." He said to the rich man, "You do not readily give away anything that is yours, but I am like someone with water rising above his head. My children are starving. Lend me 4 measures of corn." The rich man looked at him for a long time, and then the first ray of mercy began to melt a drop of the ice of greed. "I will not lend you 4 measures," he answered, "but I will give you 8, but you must fulfill one condition." "What must I do?" asked the poor man. "When I am dead, you shall watch for 3 nights by my grave." The peasant felt uneasy about this request, but in his need he would have agreed to anything. So he accepted and carried the corn home. It seemed as if the rich man had foreseen what would happen, for after 3 days he suddenly fell dead to the ground. No one knew exactly how it had come to pass, but no one mourned for him. After he was buried, the poor man remembered his promise. He would have gladly been released from it, but he thought, "After all, he acted kindly towards you. You fed your hungry children with his corn, and even if that were not the case, you have given your word and must keep it." At nightfall, he went to the churchyard and sat on the grave mound. Everything was still, only the moon shone over the graves, and sometimes an owl flew by and let out its mournful cry. When the sun rose, the poor man returned home unharmed, and the second night passed quietly in the same way. On the evening of the third day, he felt a peculiar uneasiness, as if something was still about to happen. When he went outside, he saw a man he had never seen before by the churchyard wall. He was no longer young, had scars on his face, and his eyes looked sharply and fiercely around. He was entirely covered with an old cloak, and only his large riding boots were visible. "What are you looking for here?" the peasant asked him. "Are you not afraid of the lonely churchyard?" "I am looking for nothing," he answered, "but I am also afraid of nothing. I am like the boy who went out to learn how to shiver and tried in vain, but who got the king's daughter as his wife and great wealth with her, while I have always remained poor. I am nothing but a discharged soldier and intend to spend the night here because I have no other shelter." "If you are not afraid," said the peasant, "stay with me and help me watch over the grave." "Keeping watch is a soldier's duty," he replied. "Whatever we encounter here, good or bad, we will share together." The peasant agreed, and they sat together on the grave. The grave mound. Everything remained quiet until midnight, when a sharp whistling suddenly sounded in the air, and the two watchers saw the evil one standing bodily before them. "Away with you, scoundrels!" he shouted at them. "The one lying in the grave is mine. I want to take him, and if you don't leave, I will wring your necks." The soldier responded, "Sir with the red feather, you are not my captain. I do not need to obey you, and I have not yet learned how to fear. Go away. We will stay here." The devil thought, "Gold is the best way to catch these two rascals." He changed his tone and asked quite amicably if they would accept a bag of gold and go home. The soldier replied, "That sounds acceptable, but one bag of gold will not suffice. If you will give us as much gold as will fit into one of my boots, we will leave the field to you and depart." The devil said, "I do not have that much with me, but I will fetch it. In the neighboring town lives a money changer who is a good friend of mine and will readily advance it to me." When the devil had vanished, the soldier took off his left boot and said, "We will soon fool the coal burner. Just give me your knife, comrade." He cut the sole off the boot and placed it next to the mound in the tall grass at the edge of a half-overgrown hole. "That will do," he said. "Now the chimney sweep can come." They both sat down and waited. It did not take long before the devil returned with a small bag of gold in his hand. "Just pour it in," said the soldier, raising the boot slightly, "but that will not be enough." The black one emptied the bag. The gold fell through, and the boot remained empty. The soldier shouted, "Stupid devil, that won't do. Didn't I say so right away? Go back and bring more." The devil shook his head, left, and came back after an hour with a much larger bag under his arm. "Just pour it in?" cried the soldier, "but I doubt the boot will be full." The gold clinked as it fell, but the boot remained empty. The devil looked in with his burning eyes and confirmed the truth. He exclaimed, "You have outrageously thick calves," and made a wry face. The soldier retorted, "Did you think I had a cloven foot like you? Since when have you been so stingy? Get more gold, or our deal is off." The fiend went off again. This time he stayed away longer, and when he finally appeared, he was panting under the weight of a sack on his shoulder. He emptied it into the boot, which remained as empty as before. He became furious and was about to tear the boot from the soldier's hand, but at that moment, the first ray of the rising sun broke forth in the sky, and the evil spirit fled with loud screams. The poor soul was saved. The peasant wanted to divide the gold, but the soldier said, "Give my share to the poor. I will come with you to your hut, and we will live together in peace and quiet with what remains, as long as God wills it."